Hi, I hope your day's going well. This is Dr. Payne, and this video will cover Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is all about data. We will learn how to create a table from an existing table. We will learn how to insert brand new records, copy records from one table to another, and then within those records, we're going to be able to update certain pieces of data. We're going to be able to delete the entire record, and we'll understand how commit and rollback are there to help us. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to SQL Developer, and we'll get started. So the first thing that we're going to discuss is creating a table. And we really kind of have seen this before because we've created all of our tables for our accounts payable, order management, and examples. We didn't have to create the SQL, but we went through this right before you went and ran the SQL statement because we don't want you to ever run a SQL statement or a series of SQL scripts that you don't understand, because SQL injections are really a great way to get in behind security. This is going to be a little bit different. Those tables we created from scratch, which we will review again in a future chapter, but in Chapter 7, we're really creating a table from existing table. So we're going to use our create keyword, and we're going to determine what type of object we're going to create. In this case, we're going to create a table. We're going to name our table, and then as. So we're really going and we're copying something from an existing table. That existing table, we can select the columns, and we have to identify the actual table. We can go and we can filter in or out data by using our where, group by, having, and order by. I would say most of the time you wouldn't use the order by. A lot of times you're going to go and you're going to use the where. So let's go ahead and look at an example of this. An example is to create our table called back terms. So maybe this is a backup of my terms table as, and then I have my select statement. Select all from terms. I'm just going to run this statement right here, and we can see the terms that I have. We can see the data that I have in my terms table. So I have my terms ID, my terms description, and my terms due date. Coming back over to my accounts payable, we can see that I have just one terms table. I don't have my back table yet, so I didn't really create it. So this back terms table, we are created in our same schema, but in reality, we would probably put it in a different schema. The schema would be a backup of all of our existing tables, and this is one way, and maybe not the most efficient way, to back up your tables. But I'm going to go and I'm going to run this. It's going to tell me that my table back terms has been created, but I don't see it here on the list yet. So if I come up here and I click on my refresh, I still don't see it. Sometimes it takes a little while to go through and refresh. So I'm going to try it again. So I had to hit refresh several times. Sometimes you have to come out of your tables and go back in. But here's my back terms table. So if I go into my back terms table, I'm in my data tab, and you can see it's the same exact data set that I had before. If I come into my columns are all the same. So when you copy a table using the select statement, only the structure and the data is copied over. No constraints such as the primary key are created. So you would have to go back into that table and create a constraint. We'll learn about this in a future chapter. I could also, you can see here that I'm going to select all of my data. I don't have any filters on this, so it's just bringing everything across. I can also create a table using a filter, and a filter I have in my where clause. And in this case, my where clause says where my vendor state is equal to California. So I'm copying from my vendors table, and I'm going to pull everything that's equal to that, where my vendor's in the state of California. So if I go through and run this, we can see that I have about 75 rows of records. All of these are in California. So when I create my table CA vendors, I should have 75 records in them. Whoops, my mouse went a little crazy there. So let me grab this whole thing and run it. It tells me my table CA vendors are created, Again, it's going to take a little while for this to show up. It doesn't matter how many times I hit refresh, but I'm going to come down and I'm going to go to my order management, see if I can waste some time here. So that actually took a very long time to go through and refresh. So do not panic if you don't see that right away. As long as you see down in the script output that a table has been created, your table's there. It just takes a little while to go through and refresh this, and that's fine. So if I come and I double click on CA vendors, I have again all of my column names. I have my data type. I have my nullable, whether it's allowed to be null or whether it's not allowed to be null. So that constraint does come over. And I go into my data and I should have the 75 records. So I come down and lo and behold, I have 75 records. So I've created tables two ways. I've created tables going and copying everything, all data, all columns, all records from a table. And I've done that where I've created a table from a subset of another table. So maybe you're doing a whole bunch of reports from my California table, and I would go and I would create this table, and then periodically, maybe every evening, maybe once a week, I would go and I would copy my records from my vendors table where my vendor state equal California over to my new CA vendors. Maybe this isn't a great example because I probably would just use a query to go through and refine them, but it's just an example of how to create a table from using a where statement. So I've created these tables. Well, maybe I didn't create them correctly or I just want to get rid of them. So I don't delete a table. I'm going to go and I'm going to drop a table. So to delete a table, you're going to use the drop keyword. And this is kind of similar to our create statement. So we have drop instead of create. Our object type. Remember, our object types are tables, views, indexes, so we could select any object type that we want. And then the name of that object. In this case, it's going to be a table name. So the exact syntax is going to be drop, table, and then the table name. So here are a couple of examples. I'm going to drop my CA vendors table and I'm going to drop my back terms table. So I'm going to highlight both of those and run it. So you can see that it dropped both of my CA vendors and my back terms. I'm going to open up my tables and I'm going to refresh it, and those tables are now gone. So it's the table and all associated data. So if you go and you delete or you drop a table that has active transactional data in it, you are removing that entire table and all of the associated records. Typically, the only people that have access to drop a table are a few DBAs. A programmer should never have the ability to go through and drop a table, especially in a production environment. So we've created a table, and we've created a table based on another table, and we have gone through and we have deleted those tables because we don't need those messing up our statements. Now let's move into the data side. The data side is going through and creating new records for your tables. Creating those new records, you're going to insert data. And you saw a whole bunch of insert commands you saw a whole bunch of insert statements when you were going and you were creating your tables way back when we created accounts payable schema and all the associated tables, examples, and order management. To do that, you're going to use syntax. There's two ways to do it. You can populate all columns in a record, or you can populate a portion of those columns or partial data. You're always going to use the insert keyword. You're always going to use the into, and you're always going to have your table name. This syntax is for populating all columns. So we're going to insert into our table name the values, and then we're going to put in the column values. These column values must be in the exact same order as your columns. So if I come down to my example here, I'm going to insert into vendor contacts. So let's go into our vendor contacts table, and let's go and look at the columns. And we can see that I have 3 columns in here. And those columns are vendor ID, last name, and first name. We also want to pay attention to the data type. We want to put a number for vendor ID, a varchar for last name, and a varchar for first name. So if I come back over to my insert command, I have my insert keyword, my into keyword, my table name, vendor contacts, my keyword values, and then I have 3 values because I have 3 columns. I have my first value that is a number. It is not in quotes. So my vendor ID will be 999. My last name is Payne, so I will put that in single quotes. And my last column is my first name, which would be Wendy, or the first name of your vendor contact. And I would put that in single quotes. So if I go back into my vendor contacts and I look at my data, we can see there's no vendor that is 999. We can see that there's no last name Wendy or there's no last name Payne and there's no first name Wendy. So I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to run this, and it tells me that there's 1 row inserted. So I'm going to come back into my vendor contacts. I'm going to refresh it, and we can see that my record number 9 now has vendor ID 999, last name Payne, first name Wendy. So I've gone and I've inserted that, and so life is good. The next example that I want to show you is for populating a partial columns. So in this vendor context, it was pretty easy. I had 3 columns. But if I'm going to go and I'm going to populate my vendors, maybe I don't have all this information. Maybe I only have partial information, but I want to create that particular record. So let's go into the vendors table and take a look. I'm going to go into the columns. So I have all my columns. I have my data type. I have whether it's allowed to be null or not. So I'm going to come back into my worksheet and I'm going to look at my example. So in here, I'm going to insert into vendors, my vendor ID, my vendor name, and my vendor state. The values up here, the column names, again, are partial. And the order must match my values, or my values must match the order that I have listed up here. So my vendor ID is 125, which is my first value. My second value is Cupcake by Design, which is my vendor name. And my last one is vendor state, which is Florida. So when I run this, I'm going to come up with an error. And the error says that I have all of these things that aren't allowed to be null. So if I come back into my vendors table, we can see that I have values that are allowed to be null, which are yes, and I have values that are not allowed to be null. So my ID, my name, city, state, zip, terms ID, and default account are not allowed to be null. So my constraint there is working, and it's not allowing me to create a record until I give them all the data that they want. So to populate all the data, I had to add several columns to it. I had to add my vendor city, my vendor zip code, my terms ID, and my default account. So I had to add my vendor city is my 3rd column, and then my zip code is my 5th column, and then my last 2 columns are my default terms and my account number. So now I have a complete insert statement, which the table will now accept. So if I go and I run this, it tells me I have 1 row inserted. So if I come back into my vendors table, look at my data, it always inserts it at the very last record. I don't see it here. So I come up and I hit my refresh key. I come back down. And there we are, vendor 125, Cupcakes by Design. I don't have an address. I have my city, state, zip, and then I have my last 2 columns, my default terms and default account number. So again, 2 ways to go through and to insert. I can insert something into all columns, and when you insert something into all columns, you don't have to list the columns. Or I can insert something into partial columns. I have to list the column names, and then the column name list has to match up with my values. So my first value will go into my first column name. My second value will go into my second column name. All right, so we've done insert statements where we have come up with a data. You can also insert a record by using data from another table. Syntax for this is creating a record where you're going to go and you're going to drive the data from another table. The syntax for this, we're using our insert keyword, our into keyword. We have our table names, and again, we have our column names as optional. And we're going to select, and we have our column names from a particular table, and then we could use the where condition. And we're going to end all of that with a semicolon. Coming down to our example, I want to go and I want to move into my invoice archive table. I'm not moving them, I'm copying them. I'm going to copy all of my invoices where my invoice total is null. So I don't owe them a payment, I don't have a credit total, and all of that matches with my invoice total. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run this select statement, because I want to make sure that I know what data is supposed to move over. So from here, I have a total of 74 rows. Let me move this down. So I have a total of 74 rows that I'm going to copy from my invoices table into my invoice archive table. We can see that my invoice archive table has no data in it now, but it has the same column setup as my invoice table. So I have an invoice ID, a vendor ID, invoice number, invoice date, invoice total, payment total, credit, terms, all the way down through payment date. But you can see that these two tables the structure is identical. So I'm going to come back into my worksheet and I'm going to run this entire insert statement. And when I run it, it tells me 74 rows are inserted, so that's already a good sign. I'm going to come back over to my invoice archive table and open up my data. I don't see anything there, so I'm going to refresh, and I have my 74 records. If I come back into my invoices table, I still have those same 74 records. I have not deleted them. I have not moved them. This insert statement merely copies those records from my invoices table into my invoice archive table. We will get down to deleting records. So in order to make this a full process, what I would really do is I would archive these invoices at a periodic basis. And I probably would put all of this into a trigger. And a trigger is something that runs automatically in the background. So a trigger can be based off something that the user does. It can be based off of a date. It can be based off of a time period. So maybe I would run this every 14 days, every 7 days. I would run it probably at least once a month, where I would be taking old invoice data out of my invoice table and I would move it to my invoice archive table. I would create the records first, and then I would go through, excuse me, my mouse is a little crazy today. I would create the records first, and then I would come back into my invoice table and I would delete those records. And we'll talk about deleting those in a moment. So again, 3 ways to create records. I can insert into a table all columns, I can insert partial columns, and I can insert from an existing record. So I can copy records from a table to a table. However, none of that is saved until you use the keyword commit. So you would have to commit that data. If I don't commit that data, that data will be lost eventually, and there's a time period that's set up on the server. So if you're on campus and you're going and you're creating all of this data and you don't commit it, I bet you by the time you get home and you sign back into your SQL developer into the Oracle server, that data will not be there. So you always want to make sure you run your commit command. And your commit command is very simple. It's commit with a semicolon. Once I go through and run this, it tells me my commit is complete. So all of those records that I have added are now saved permanently. I can go back and I can delete them, but the system won't automatically go through and get rid of them. And the question that I usually get is why? Why aren't all your transactions or all your records, once they're created, automatically saved? Well, think about going to the ATM. You go to the ATM and you say that you want to get $100 out, and you put your card in, and you don't get $100, but your card comes out and it looks like the transaction is processed. Well, you don't get your $100. Do you want them to take the $100 out of your account? So there's several things that happen when you go to the ATM. It will go and it will debit your account for the $100 or whatever cash you took out. It will credit their overall cash account and it will give you $100. So it will go and it will create a minimum of 2 records in their system. You don't want all of those records committed until that transaction is 100% complete. If anything happens in the meantime, you want the ability for those records to be removed. In this case, you want them to be rolled back to what they were initially. So that's why you don't commit your records, or your records aren't saved automatically until you go through and you commit. So let me give you an example of rolling back. So I'm going to go back into my vendors table and let's just look at our data one more time. We can see that our last record is our Cupcakes by Design. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to insert a new record. It's going to be Pain Relief Bakery, city, state. We have all the required information. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to run this. And it tells me I have one row that has been inserted. Come back into my vendor table. I'm going to just go ahead and refresh it and come down to the very bottom. I have my Pain Relief Bakery vendor ID 126. So my record has been created. But I want to go and I want to undo that for whatever reason. So my transaction didn't occur. The vendor decided not to participate. They didn't like our terms or whatever. So I'm going to go and I'm going to roll this back. So once I roll it back, it tells me my rollback is complete. I'm going to come into my vendor table and refresh it. Now I'm going to come down to the very, very end, and we can see that the Pain Relief Bakery is no longer a vendor, that my last vendor is Cupcake by Design. Again, rollback will undo everything from the last time you committed or when you went and you created a save point. And a save point is not something that we talk about in this class, but a save point, or is not something that is in the book. A save point is a place where you can say, I want all of these transactions really to be committed up until this point, and I can roll back to that particular save point. So it's just a point in time where you can batch rollback, if you will. Come and I'm going to create that insert one more time, and now I'm going to commit it. And once I've committed it, I'm going to come back into my vendor table, refresh it, and now I have both my Cupcakes by Design and my Pain Relief Bakery. I'm going to come back over to my worksheet and I'm going to roll it back. And if I roll back where it says my rollback is complete, I'm going to come into my vendor table, refresh it, and my record should still be there. So I have Cupcakes by Design and Pain Relief Bakery. Both of them are, at this point in time, are permanently saved, but I can always go through and I can delete those records at some point in time. Again, you want to make sure that when you're doing a series of data changes, that you always commit those changes. And as you're going through and you're working on your exercises, my recommendation to you is to commit on a periodic basis. Created tables from tables. We've created records, partial, full, and we've created records from existing records. We've committed that data. Now we want to change one piece of data. So let's say, let me spell this correctly first. Let's say that a user has gotten married and they want their last name changed. So they're going to come to you at some point in time and they want their last name changed. I'm telling you, as soon as they get a divorce, they want their name changed back to their maiden name. It seems to happen much quicker after a divorce than an actual marriage. To go and to change one piece of data or a couple of pieces of data, so you have your update keyword, your table name, your set keyword, your column name, whatever value you're going to assign it to, and then you have your where clause. It says that your where clause is optional. I say that you should always use it, because the problem is if you don't use the where clause, it will update all your existing rows and records. So you want to be able to go and you want to be able to update only a handful of records. So here's an example. I have my vendors. I want to update my vendor city to Panama City Beach, where my vendor ID equals 125. So I'm going to come into my vendor table. I'm going to go down to my vendor ID 125, and I'm going to come over to the city. And in this case, the city is Panama City. I want to update that to Panama City Beach. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to run this, and it will go and it tells me one row is updated. I'm going to come back into my vendor table. I'm going to refresh it, come back down to my record, and we can see that it was updated to Panama City Beach. Again, this is not saved. So if I go and I do a rollback command and run that, it will undo what I just did. So if I come back in here, I refresh it, it changes it back to Panama City. So anytime you're inserting, updating, you want to make sure that you go and you commit. So I've updated that one row, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to commit that data. And so I'm going to run my commit. So that was updating one column at a time, but let's say you have more than one column. What you do is you still use one set keyword. You place a comma between your values. I moved them down a line. You don't have to move them down a line. You can string them out. I like them down one line. I think it's easier to read. My new column name and then my new value. I can go and I can run this. So this updates my record where my vendor ID is 125. Come in and refresh. And then I'm going to come down. I've changed my vendor state and my zip code. Again, this doesn't commit it. So if I do a rollback, I'm going to come back into my vendor state will be Florida, and my vendor zip will represent a Florida zip code. So there's Florida and my associated zip code. So that was going through and updating one column, one piece of data at a time. If I went and I just got rid of my where statement and I ran this, it would update all of my records so that my state and all my records would be California and my zip code would be 20503. So if I run this, it tells me it updated 124 records, which is scary. I come back into my vendor table, I refresh. We can see that my vendor state and my vendor zip code is there, and it's the same for every single vendor, which we know is not right. So I'm going to come back, I'll roll back, come back into vendors, and everything's back to normal. So life is good now. That's why you always want to use a where statement. If you don't use the where statement, it will update every single record in your table. So the next thing we're going to talk about is using a subquery to update records. My subquery I'm going to use in my where statement. I'm going to first select all of my vendors that live in California, Arizona, or Nevada. So I go through, it gives me all my vendor IDs, and then I'm going to come back and it tells me that I have, let me put my end of parentheses back, it tells me that I have a total of 80 records. So I'm going to update 80 records, and I'm going to set my terms ID to 1. So maybe there's some type of regulation that changed where I want to set my terms ID to 1 for all of these states. So if I go and I run this, it tells me I updated 51 rows in my invoices table. So I'm going to come over to my invoices table. I'm going to refresh it. And then for every record that I have that is in California or in, what were the other ones? That was in California, Arizona, or Nevada, that it would go through and it would update it. It updated my invoices table based on information from my vendors table. So again, I used a subquery with that. So there's many different ways to update records. Typically, you're going to update a record based on something that the user did. So the user placed an order. So I'm going to come down to my order management tables. So when a customer places an order, it will create an order record. That order record is the overarching record. And then it will create order detailed records based on what they have actually ordered. So my order details creates a record for every individual item that they ordered. So I have an order ID, an order item, and an order quantity. So coming down, I can see that I have order ID 802 and 802. I've ordered item ID 2 and item ID 3, and I've ordered a quantity of each. But 802 is my overarching record. So when I created an order, it created an order record in my orders table, and in this case, it created two records in my order detail table. And you're going to use some type of insert statement for that, and you might be able to use an update statement depending on what you're going through when you're doing. The last couple things that we're going to talk about are deleting. You can see here I say that deleting the statement is very dangerous. You always want to use the where condition with it, always. If not, you're going to delete all of your records. So in this case, it says delete from invoice archive. I'm going to come back up to my accounts payable. My invoice archive, we can see, I think I had 74 records in here. So once I run this, it will delete all the records from the table. So I've come into my invoice archive. I still have my records, but once I hit refresh, they are all gone. I can get them back. I can get them back by doing a rollback. And if I do my rollback, all of my data will now be back. So you want to be careful when you go through and you actually delete your records. This doesn't use a where statement, so this deleted everything. So I'd like to use the where condition. So in this case, I'm going to delete from my vendor contacts where my vendor ID is 125. So if I go and I run this, it tells me I have no rows deleted. So let's go back into my vendor contacts, and I'm going to refresh it. Well, I don't have a vendor ID of 125. I'm going to delete my record, which was 999. But see how safe that was? Because I put the incorrect vendor ID down here, it didn't delete anything. Now I have my vendor ID, one row deleted, come back into my vendor contacts, and there's my record is removed. Again, I can roll back, but in this case, I don't want to. I want to commit all of these changes. And so I'm going to run that, and my commit's complete. Always when you delete, you want to use a where statement. If not, all your records are going to be gone. If you have a commit on the end of that, all of those records are permanently gone, or you can go back into an archive. In this chapter, we learned about creating tables from other tables, creating records, full, partial, creating records from other records, updating specific pieces of data. We can update one specific piece of data or multiple pieces of data using the update statement. And using the update statement, we can update pieces based on a subquery or based on a select statement. We learned about rollback and commit, and we learned about deleting those particular records. This is all based on your data, not on your structure, based on your data. So now it's your time to go and to practice. So what I want you to do is I want you to complete the chapter exercises on page 1 through 5. Complete the chapter exercises 1 through 5 on page 230, and then complete the practice exercises. If you have questions, please contact me. Come to the online session. Come see me during my office hours. I hope you have a great day. Thank you.